Lisa, my understanding is you're ready to break down the birthright citizenship ruling for us.
Yeah, and it's narrower, Antonia, than we thought it was going to be, certainly by listening to oral argument. There are 5 justices who have voted to say that the 14th Amendment's citizenship clause protects birthright citizenship as we have long understood it. A 6th justice, Justice Kavanaugh, joins the opinion in part, but not in whole. And let me read to you his stunning first paragraph. He says that the executive order that's at issue here establishes new exceptions to birthright citizenship for children born to foreign citizens unlawfully or temporarily in the country. That the court today holds that the order violates the 14th Amendment. I respectfully disagree with the court's constitutional holding. In my view, the executive order doesn't violate the 14th Amendment, but it does contravene a federal statute. And then Justice Kavanaugh goes out of his way to say, consistent with the 14th Amendment, Congress could amend that statute or otherwise enact new legislation establishing exceptions to birthright citizenship for children born to foreign citizens unlawfully or temporarily in the country, but Congress has not yet done so. In other words, 5 justices saying the Constitution is the Constitution is the Constitution, and Justice Kavanaugh saying, yeah, I agree with them in terms of the state of federal law, but if Congress wants to change this, that's up to Congress. And so let me make a larger point about Justice Kavanaugh today. We often talk about the Roberts Court. After today, this term at least will be a big, thumb on the scale, fist on the table for Brett Kavanaugh, who has issued multiple majority opinions today and also is really the big deciding vote here, right? By concurring in the judgment, but also leaving for another day whether Congress can make a different decision. You can see how in a court composed a little bit differently, because it is only a 5-4 decision on the constitutional ground, how this could have gone very differently, despite the fact that after oral argument, many of us thought this might be a 7-2 decision. And instead, what you've got is only 5 justices saying constitutionally birthright citizenship is the law of the land, a 6th saying it's the law of the land, but only because of federal statute. And then you've got 3 other justices saying no. They would side with the president here and say that the executive order is perfectly consistent with the Constitution of the United States because, I believe, of this phrase in the middle of the citizenship clause saying subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That was the argument that the Solicitor General made at oral argument, saying that it doesn't cover people who are not permanently domiciled in this country, making an argument that Wong Kim Ark, this 120-plus-year precedent, did not settle for all time, whether somebody born in this country was in fact a citizen, but was intended to be always a narrower ruling based on the fact that Wong Kim Ark's parents had settled in California, that they always intended to remain there. They had no allegiance to their home country. And John Sauer sort of using that to drive a wedge into that citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment that previously courts did not understand to exist.
Fallon Gallagher, if you're still there outside of the Supreme Court, I'm wondering if you can give us some color here, because as Lisa just described, I mean, for months now, people have been both pretty publicly and behind the scenes expecting something closer to a 7-2 decision here. How shocked are people where you are?
Yeah, they're not shocked, but not as much reaction as I would have imagined here for such a big decision, especially one that we knew was coming today. I actually would say that I heard louder cheers when we actually got the transgender athlete ban. But again, like you said, this is a narrower split than we had anticipated. After arguments, it seemed like there was no question that the Supreme Court was going to hold up birthright citizenship. It was just a matter of how broadly, whether that was going to be 7-2 or 8-1. So a 6-3, really more of what seems to be a 5.5, 3.5, if you look at the Kavanaugh split, is a much closer ruling than we would have imagined. But again, this is still a big loss for the president, overturning one of his signature executive orders that he signed on his first day in office, upholding birthright citizenship. And as you know, this has been enshrined in our country for a very long time. We had the 14th Amendment, of course, after the Civil War. But then the Supreme Court itself upheld this precedent in 1898 with that case, Wong Kim Ark, where it said that if you are born on U.S. soil, you have birthright citizenship. And so that remains to be the case here. As far as the reaction here, Antonia, I would not be surprised if this starts to build throughout the day as word spreads. Decisions are a little bit less buzzy than they used to be in the pre-COVID times because you don't have to actually run them out in the same way. So this is one where I think the crowd will gradually build here because this is, at the end of the day, still a win for birthright citizenship.
Catherine, given what we've seen Kavanaugh do today, what does that signal to you about what may be to come here?
Well, I think it's important to say who the 5 justices are who said the Fourth Amendment means what it says. Roberts, Barrett, Sotomayor, Jackson, and Kagan. And we can expect, which was happened in the Terrace case, the president might have some words to say about Justice Barrett and Justice Roberts. But as Lisa pointed out, Kavanaugh could have went the other way, and instead of it being, 6 votes, but it's thankfully the decision came out right, but it's shocking. I was one of those I said to Lisa, it should be 9-0, but it'll probably be 7-2. Well, shocking. So we have Gorsuch, Alito, and Thomas, who basically have said, you can have an executive order that changes the Constitution. It's 194 pages. I'm not as fast a reader as Lisa is, but I'll be interesting to see their rationale. For
I would love to come back to one of the two of you in a minute to get an understanding from those 3 of what their explanation is here.
I will tell you what it's not.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, one of the things that's surprising to me here is that at oral argument, and I was listening to it again this morning, Justice Alito essentially recognized a really pragmatic concern. And he basically told the Solicitor General that if there were people who were subject to removal at any time, if they were apprehended and they have in their minds made a permanent home here in the United States, they've established roots. He said that raises a humanitarian problem. And I wonder, Mr. Sauer, if you can address that. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, that's a remarkably pragmatic and also compassionate thing for Justice Alito to say about sort of what we'll call the reliance interests at issue here, right? If you have parents who have come here and they are undocumented and they have made a life here and you know no country other than this. Now, granted, the executive order only covers babies who are born after a particular point in time, but his larger point is, how do you square the fact that there's going to be some real life impact on the ground here if we uphold this executive order? That doesn't appear to be a concern for him today as a dissenter.
Again, I think it is that question of intention versus impact as you're sort of looking at the court and its rationale. For me, as a civil rights attorney, Antonia, I'm really looking at the origin of where these particular amendments come from. These are Reconstruction amendments that were essentially drafted after slavery to provide citizenship to freed black persons in America whose generations before them had been enslaved. And I think that the court's defense of this is critically important because while we are having this conversation in the context of birther tourism and immigration and things of that nature, had the Supreme Court not decided the way that they did, what is to stop the executive branch from issuing another order that's even more restrictive in terms of how we define who an American is or is not, and a citizen is or is not? And again, when you're thinking about the spirit of the law, when you think about the origin of these amendments themselves, without that power being limited or restricted, without the Constitution and its amendment being defended as written, the president can legislate in a way that I do not believe he was ever intended to. And what we see from the court in its decision is that they're stopping him from doing that, at least in this instance. I do agree strongly with Catherine, as well as Lisa. Should have been more people defending it, in my opinion. The fact that it survived so narrowly should be a concern because to the point that Lisa was making about Kavanaugh's opinion in this matter, he's basically laid out a path for Congress to say, all right, it didn't get done today, but if you want to do it, this is the way to go. So I also think, to the question that you had asked previously, this is not over either. This is just likely going to be a battle that takes a different form. And for those people who are looking at this and wondering why does it matter? It matters because this is what defines what it is to be an American.
And it was really interesting. You're talking about the history of slavery here and the significance of that to our nation's founding and to the establishment of all of this. The president, who normally actually tries to downplay the role of slavery, did try to use it to his advantage in this case by basically almost acting as though he was like a defender of something that was specially done for black people and therefore has now been sort of misconstrued and accidentally done as a favor to everyone else. You know, we'll leave that to the side here. I'm going to.
Today is a victory for immigrant families, but it is also a victory for every American who believes in fairness, equality, and the Constitution of the United States of America.
Today's ruling offers reassurance that their children's rights remain protected. But this decision must also remind us that protecting constitutional rights requires constant vigilance.
Hi again, everyone. It's now 5 o'clock in the East. Constant vigilance is right, because in Donald Trump's America, none of us can afford to be complacent. In many instances, Donald Trump's priorities may seem to flip and flop, and he may seem to snooze through some of them. First he's for something, then he doesn't care, then he seems to abandon it altogether. But when it came to birthright citizenship and ending it, Trump's interest in this issue was clear and consistent. It was always something he felt very strongly about, sort of like tariffs. The executive order that today's Supreme Court ruling weighed in on was one he signed on the first day of his second term as president. Trump even showed up for oral arguments in this case back in April, becoming the first sitting president of the United States of America to do that. So his loss today at the hands of a majority conservative Supreme Court, many of the members he picked, is a big one. But as we discussed over the last hour, the ruling was actually closer than it looks. Justice Brett Kavanaugh agreed with the majority that Trump's executive order was illegal, yet he dissented in part and seemed to give Congress an instruction or invitation to keep fighting this issue. Donald Trump seized on that perceived invitation and called on Congress to act immediately. Republican Senator Eric Schmidt of Missouri responded, posting this on social media, quote, "Justice Kavanaugh may have left Congress a door. I'm filing legislation to walk through it." Senator Schmidt's Senate colleague, Democrat Alex Padilla, underscored the need to keep fighting in a powerful response. Quote, "The Constitution could not be clearer. If you are born in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States, period. No ambiguity." While there is nothing surprising about Donald Trump's efforts to erode birthright citizenship and disregard laws he does not like, today's decision reaffirms over a century of legal precedent protecting this fundamental constitutional right. This is personal. I'm a proud son of immigrants. I was born in the United States. I'm a proud citizen of the United States with freedom to pursue the American dream. While we celebrate this ruling today, we cannot rest, because this is certainly not the end of Trump's attacks on our Constitution, on our democracy, and the notion of what it means to be American. As Americans, we will continue to organize, vote, legislate, and litigate because our country depends on it. Not giving up in the fight to protect our Constitution is where we begin the hour with Democratic Senator Alex Padilla of California. Also joining me for the hour, my friend, political analyst, host of the Bulwark podcast, Tim Miller's here. Senator, I start with you. Your reaction first to the decision.
Hi, Nicole. Well, I'll tell you what, I've heard from a lot of folks from California to Washington and everywhere in between. What does it say that we were waiting with bated breath for the Supreme Court to uphold the Constitution, right? We were praying for this outcome, but preparing for some devastating news, because that's the times that we're living in, whether it's a Supreme Court that will act in ways that we can't understand, or Donald Trump and the next thing that will come out of his mouth. We know that the debate doesn't end here. We won a big case at the Supreme Court today, and that deserves to be celebrated, especially in light of the 4th of July coming up at the end of the week. But as so many of us are saying, we know the work's not over. Trump will continue to press this issue. He'll continue to attack, maybe revisit a different executive order, the push through Congress, and you've seen some of the Republican members of Congress already jumping at his command. So we will legislate however we can, litigate when we need to, but we'll continue to organize and mobilize to vote this November, because the political pushback is the ultimate accountability.
Senator, I made the same point about the press coverage, that we've largely covered this case as the big one, but we've covered it as a jump ball. We'll see what they do, assuming nothing. What does it say about our country that on the press end, we've covered this as it could go either way? People have, as you said, been waiting with bated breath to see whether something written down in the Constitution would survive the second Trump term.
Right. And so we can have the policy discussion and debate. I think history is very, very clear. We can, of course, have the political discussion and debate because it will not end as long as Trump is in office. But let's not forget the personal, right? What it means for people. I've been sharing throughout the day of how this is personal for me, not just as a proud son of immigrants. My parents immigrated to the United States in the 1960s. I was born here, so I'm a citizen by birth, and I've been able to live the American dream, including but not limited to serving as a member of the United States Senate. But when my wife, Angela, and I are having conversations with our kids about issues, and they ask us, well, what if the Supreme Court, found differently? What does it mean, not just for my parents? What does that not just mean for my wife and I? What does that mean for our own children? Because if we lose our citizenship, as no doubt Donald Trump would like to see happen, what does that mean for our kids? Do we get to stay? Do we have to self-deport? And that just happened to be our family, but I assure you, millions of families across the country were having those same very difficult conversations and experiencing that same sort of anxiety and uncertainty. And so thank God the Supreme Court got it right this time.
The case started making its way toward the court. I mean, he signed this executive order on the first day of his term. It feels like 11 years ago, but it was about 18 months ago. Immigration is actually more popular now than it was when he was elected a second time. You were manhandled, I think that's the most diplomatic way to put it, by Kristi Noem's security entourage. We had a lot of eyes on the ground in Minneapolis. But the excesses of ICE are ongoing, and I wonder what your thoughts are on the current immigration regime of the Trump White House.
Yeah, and so look, I'll tell you this, Nicole, the cruelty continues. The cruelty is just less visible than it was a year ago or even 6 months ago. The detention and arrests of nonviolent criminals, right? Because for as much as talk there is about the worst of the worst and the dangerous violent criminals, the majority of people being detained, even deported without due process, are not that. But what hasn't been seen, not on cable news every night and not on social media feeds, is the conditions in detention facilities. So horrible. Lack of access to clean water, food that's rotten or has maggots in it, lack of medical attention, even for folks in critical conditions. The cruelty is the point for this administration, and the cruelty trying to drive people to just waive their rights and self-deport. I think that's why public opinion has shifted, because it was one thing to say, well, let's secure the border, but the cruelty we've seen in communities across the country is not what people signed up for. Not only is it unpopular, they know it's not good. It's not good policy, and it's not good for the economy. When people are afraid to go to work, when people are afraid to go shopping, when you're deporting people who work in the fields, of course the price of food is going to go up. When you're deporting construction workforce, of course the cost of housing is going to go up. So people have seen Trump for what he truly is now, and that's why the approval ratings have flipped.
The approval rating for the court is also at an historic low. When you take the body of the language of the dissents from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson to Justice Elena Kagan and Justice Sotomayor in the various decisions eliminating temporary protective status, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's concurrence today on birthright citizenship, her pointed sort of rebuttal to Thomas. What do you make of the state of polarization among the writings of the justices themselves?
Yeah, again, the public confidence in the Supreme Court is not nearly what it should be, even on a case as clear as this birthright citizenship, right? The Constitution couldn't be clearer. You read my statement earlier. Anybody born in the United States is a citizen of the United States, period. All right, couldn't be any more clear than that. And even then, with that language in the Constitution, it was not a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court. Thankfully, it was a majority, but it wasn't unanimous. So again, we have to continue not just to wonder, but to continue to be vigilant. The attacks from the Trump administration and from, MAGA Republicans are going to continue. So we'll have to continue to resist, have to continue to fight back and defend our values, defend our rights, and build on them for future generations.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. The Supreme Court waited until the very last day of its term, the last day of June, to drop its decision in the biggest case of the year. A case in which the Trump administration was seeking to obliterate the constitutional order that our country erected after the bloodshed of the Civil War, when we defeated slavery and amended the Constitution to state explicitly that this country was based on the principle that all citizens are equal before the law and that if you are born here, you are a citizen. No ifs, ands, or buts. That vision of the country is the one that Donald Trump and Stephen Miller and the MAGA movement are fundamentally committed to destroying. Openly. They keep saying it. And they made that clear on day one, January 20th, 2025, just minutes after being sworn back in as president, when Trump first signed pardons for all the insurrectionists who had tried to violently overturn a Democratic election 4 years earlier, an election in which he had, by the way, massively lost among non-white voters. And then right after he signed those pardons, Trump signed an order claiming that some natural-born U.S. citizens shouldn't be citizens.
This next order relates to the definition of birthright citizenship under the 14th Amendment of the United States.
Good. That's a good one. Birthright. That's a big one.
What about that one in the courts? That one is likely to be found.
Could be. We think we have good grounds, but you could be right. I mean, you'll find out.
Well, today, Trump found out, as the Supreme Court ruled that Trump's attempts to undo birthright citizenship are unconstitutional. A 5-4 decision on that question, in which all 3 liberal justices joined conservatives, Amy Coney Barrett and Chief Justice John Roberts. Writing for the majority, Roberts stated the 14th Amendment clearly means what it says. Quote, citizenship then and now was the right to have rights, to freely participate in our political community. The framers of the 14th Amendment extended that promise to every freeborn person in this land. We keep that promise today. That was always what the court should have said to the Trump administration. Their case against birthright citizenship was always just an unconstitutional shot in the dark, a bad faith, crankish reading of the 14th Amendment motivated by racism and xenophobia.
The idea that you can have a country where you just set foot on U.S. soil and any child you have gets to be an American citizen and vote in our elections, collect our welfare, sit in our juries, sit in judgment of our fellow men and women is such an outrage to the idea of having a country. It defies the scriptures. I don't know what they're going to do, but here's what I can say. If this country doesn't, one way or another, end birthright citizenship, this country doesn't have a future. Citizenship has to be sacred and precious.
I really struggle to accurately convey just how extreme, how unhinged, and how, frankly, racist that position is. But let me try. Stephen Miller's reading of the 14th Amendment had already been repudiated by the Supreme Court more than a century ago. It's a famous case. It was in 1898, the case of Wong Kim Ark, who was born in the U.S. to Chinese parents. That court then, operating in 1898, said, if you're born in the U.S., you're a U.S. citizen. They looked at the plain text of the law, and they found that. And they handed down that decision, get this, 2 years after upholding racial segregation in Plessy v. Ferguson. Those justices, the ones who enshrined Jim Crow and the laws of the United States, they cemented separate but equal. But even they upheld birthright citizenship in a 6-2 vote because the language of the 14th was plain as day. That is how racist Stephen Miller and Donald Trump's argument is. It is more racist than a racist reactionary court, the infamous Plessy court, was almost 130 years ago. Think about that. And the other thing is, there hasn't been any real legal or historical shift away from birthright citizenship since then. There were a few, again, anti-immigrant cranks on the right, which you'll always find, right, turning out diatribes against anchor babies. But didn't matter. Naturally, Donald Trump courted them. And then last year, remember, he finds himself back in office, and he's got his hand-picked 6-3 Supreme Court majority, where 3 of the justices were the ones that he elevated. And so he went to work pressuring them to reimagine the Constitution. In fact, to rewrite it, to essentially amend the Constitution by fiat in collusion with him and 5 votes. Remember that he even went to oral arguments to physically intimidate them, to glower at them. It was a first for a sitting president. Now, it didn't quite work. He lost today. We all, as Americans, won. The court still did the right thing, but barely. I mean, by a shockingly narrow margin, by 1 vote. In 1898, the margin was 4 votes. Today, by 1 vote, this court rejected what would amount to rewriting the Constitution on the fly. In some senses, overturning the victory of the Union forces and the multiracial coalition that refounded the country after that victory in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Essentially just taking white out to an amendment that was bought with the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans in the Civil War. It's jarring to think that the very right to have rights in America hinged this week on John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett. The lesson here is Donald Trump lost, thankfully, but this court, it has to be addressed. It has to be dealt with. And this movement, the movement that brought us to this point, has to be defeated thoroughly and completely, because the goal is nothing less than uprooting the very foundational principles that make this country so special and so worth fighting for. Sherilyn Ifill is the Vernon Jordan Chair in Civil Rights at Howard University. She's also the founding director of the university's 14th Amendment Center for Law and Democracy. She was in the Supreme Court gallery during oral arguments in this case. Cheryl, it's just an honor to have you on the program. And first, let me just say, I feel somewhat sheepish giving a little spiel before you because you've forgotten more about the 14th Amendment than I've ever known. So let me just turn it over to you and say, what is your takeaway from today's decision?
Chris, first of all, thanks for having me. And second of all, that was an excellent spiel on the 14th Amendment. You know, you hit the high notes. Yes, the decision in this case came out the way it should have come out. But first of all, it came out the way it should have come out last year when this case was Trump versus Casa. As you'll recall, the Supreme Court then used that case to address the issue of district courts granting and ordering nationwide injunctions, something they've long wanted to get at. And that required the refiling of a new case as a class action that became Trump versus Barbara. What I mean to say is that the court has slow-walked this. This was a case grounded in the actual words, not the penumbra, nothing that they had to interpret, the actual words of the 14th Amendment, and an over 100-year-old precedent by the court itself, which, as you pointed out, has never been broken or undermined in any way. And they took this long. This is not just the court deliberating and going back and forth and taking this long. This is the court allowing space to develop for the idea that this was a legitimate argument, for the idea that this was a legitimate claim, when, as you say, this was a bit of constitutional gaslighting. But every time they do that, they give strength to the idea that they are making legitimate arguments on the right about things like birthright citizenship. So first of all, to sit there today and have the decision come out the way I wanted it to come out in terms of the judgment, but have it come out after over a year is just absurd. A year and a half of leaving the country confused about the most important thing, who's an American. So I just thought that was grossly irresponsible. Secondly, as I think you also were pointing out, this case was not unanimous. This should have been a 9-0 decision. This was a slam dunk. It wasn't. It was a, 5-4, maybe 6-3 decision, and it matters. It matters that this was a split decision, because once again, it gives legitimacy to the idea that birthright citizenship can be overturned. The fact that there are these dissenting opinions from Justice Alito, Justice Gorsuch, and Justice Thomas, some of whom joined one another, but each of whom felt they needed to write their own dissenting opinion, and then a concurring and dissenting opinion from Justice Kavanaugh, who agrees with the judgment, but, and this was very obvious at oral argument as well, Justice Kavanaugh, who loves the world of politics, believes that Congress has the right to do what the president tried to do. The president can't overcome birthright citizenship by EO, but Justice Kavanaugh believes that by statute Congress can. And that little space was important for him to leave to the political process. And of course, earlier today, we heard Trump already announcing his intention to exploit that space.
Yeah, let me just, in case people are confused because they read that it was a 6-3 decision, the main holding, which is that they struck down the executive order, was a 6-3 decision. But on the narrow question of, is it constitutionally the case, as grounded in the 14th Amendment, that all citizens born here are citizens? It was narrow in 5-4, and this is because Kavanaugh says, in my view, the executive order does not violate the 14th Amendment, but the order does contravene a federal statute, because there's a statute also passed. Congress could enact new legislation establishing exceptions to birthright citizenship for children born to foreign citizens unlawfully or temporarily in the country, but Congress has not yet done so. And then, as you note, on cue, Trump says, the Supreme Court upheld birthright citizenship, which is too bad for our country, but we can easily make it up in Congress through legislation with the support of the president that has now been determined during this process. No long and unwieldy constitutional amendments necessary. Congress should start today to work on ending expensive and unfair to our country birthright citizenship. They will have my complete and total support. We should note that what Trump is saying there is wrong. That's not actually the holding. That's Kavanaugh's holding, but not actually the holding, right?
Yes. But again, it keeps this conversation going. It keeps it in the political realm as though it is not an absurd and ludicrous and anti-constitutional ideology. And this is how you go about trying to do a kind of paper insurrection, you know, a political insurrection rather than a violent physical one, which is that you just keep wearing at that rock, you know, trying to undermine the principles that have been created, what it took to create the 14th Amendment and what the 14th Amendment stands for. And this is why I love Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's concurrence in this case, because she just wipes the table on the history of what this was supposed to be about. Our Constitution is not colorblind. The framers of the 14th Amendment were involved in a very race-conscious project, and that project was to remove caste and subordination from who could be an American and who could be a first-class citizen. So it's important that she goes into that history. I love that she cited in one of her footnotes the brief that I wrote along with Professor Guy Uriel Charles at Harvard Law School, aided by our students, but that she really goes into the history to make clear this was never a race-free, a colorblind project. They were very intentional about creating a multiracial democracy. And the more the forces on the right try to move us away from knowing that truth, knowing the truth that over 150 years ago, the framers of our second founding wanted this to be a multiracial democracy and created a constitutional infrastructure that would allow it to become a multiracial democracy. The more people are removed from that knowledge, the more they will believe that when they see black people fully integrated into our society, when they see people who come here and who have children who are born here being U.S. citizens, and as Stephen Miller railed about, you know, making judgments about us and voting in our elections, the more they will think that the ideas that resist that are actually legitimate ideas and not fundamentally anti-constitutional ideas. And I think that's what this has been about. This has been about creating a space for that.
And just to, you know, to take a step back, too, I mean, again, we're in the sort of text of the Constitution, and I was going to read a portion of the debate in 1866 where someone says, well, what about the gypsies that are invading Pennsylvania? They say, well, the only invaders I know in Pennsylvania were the Confederate Army, and we're trying to prevent that from happening again.
Yes.
So, again, they knew. Like,
what about the Chinese in California? Yes. They also had their prejudices. Right.
Exactly, but to just take a step back here, it's like it's so striking to me, and this is not a novel insight, but like the thing that I cherish the most about this country, that I think is so beautiful, is the thing they hate the most. I mean, for me, it's like, yes, this principle, whoever you are, we're all equal, and that this is enshrined, and that we've created a republic, we founded kind of a second republic based on that. After the bloodshed of the Civil War, and that's the thing that they hate the most, and that they've got haters on the Supreme Court. I mean, if you read that Alito dissent, like, he hates that principle.
Yeah, but that's fundamentally un-American. And to me, listening to Stephen Miller today, it was hearing someone who wants to be in another country. There are many countries, the old countries of Europe from which his family and many others in the cabinet came were countries like that, were countries where you were German because your father was German, or Polish because your father was Polish. That's not what this country set about to do. And so I think when you hear them speaking, and I really mean this, it's very important to understand, it is counter to the project, the idea of America. And because we're celebrating our 250th anniversary, this is why it's so important not to just focus on the first founding of the country in 1776 and our Constitution in 1789, but also to make sure that you include the second founding, because this country has evolved, and that second founding is intentionally looking at the need for us, if we are going to be one unified country. They had seen how race could tear us apart and break us apart and threaten the nation. And they created an infrastructure to ensure that there would be glue to hold us together. And what these folks are trying to do right now is to break us back apart. So it's a very, very dangerous project. I'm glad the Supreme Court decided what they decided today. I'm profoundly disturbed that it was as close as it was.
With the future of hundreds of thousands of children and American identity itself on the line, let's bring in Melissa Murray, former clerk to Sonia Sotomayor and an MS Now legal analyst. Mark Joseph Stern, a senior writer at Slate and co-host of the Amicus podcast. And joining us from the White House, MS Now's Laura Barron Lopez. Melissa, you have said to me since day one, they're going to do the right thing. Don't give them any flowers when they do. This was a crisis of the court's own making.
Yeah, Alicia, that is exactly right. I'm glad that the court reached this decision. I will say that it is a travesty that this is not a unanimous decision. It seems it's either a 5-4 or 6-3 decision, depending on how you count on this constitutional question. So apparently there are some members of the court who do not believe that the very straightforward and cut and dried language of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment reads what it says. But more than that, this court had an opportunity last term when it had the Trump versus Casa case where they could have answered this substantive question. In Trump versus Casa, the court had the opportunity to weigh in on whether the nationwide injunction was a permissible remedy for district courts to issue. They substantially narrowed the range of available remedies in those kinds of lawsuits. But they also declined the opportunity, which the ACLU and several plaintiffs' rights groups offered, to answer this question about the meaning and substance of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. And the court declined to do so a year ago at that time. Instead, they let this question about the status of these children fester and linger for an entire year. They allowed a theory that heretofore had been the province of kooks and cranks on the right wing to actually gain legitimacy. So they have done the right thing today. But the real winner here is the court, which in a term in which it has decimated Voting Rights Act, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, limited protections for trans athletes, gets to go out on a high. We should not reward them by saying that they saved birthright citizenship. They should have done this a year ago, and this entire outcome was literally foreordained by the text of the Constitution itself. They did no more than do the reading here.
Let's talk about that text of the Constitution, Mark. The 14th Amendment clearly states all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. You'll remember from the hearing on this, the back and forth between Sauer, where he tried to make this about the fact that immigration to this country had changed. And it was actually Roberts who said back to him, yeah, immigration may have changed. The Constitution has not. Why did the court take two cases tied to this executive order, spend so much time making this decision, and then take 194 pages in order to explain something that is fairly plain?
I think one obvious answer to the question is that the court is much more closely divided on this than many of us had expected, including me. This really came down to a 5-4 decision on the constitutional question that the 14th Amendment means what it says. Justice Kavanaugh agreed that Trump's executive order violates a federal statute, but he expressly held that it does not necessarily violate the 14th Amendment. He said Congress is free to revise birthright citizenship and to expand the number of children and the kinds of children who are excluded from its promise. So this was a bare majority of the court agreeing that the foundational promise of the Reconstruction era still holds in 2026. And clearly there was a lot of debate about this behind the scenes, again, more so than I expected. Clearly Justice Thomas is furious. He feels that the majority has sort of extended this right that was really only intended for the children of enslaved people to immigrants who don't really deserve it. Obviously, even Justice Gorsuch, who seemed like a solid vote against the Trump administration, actually thinks that Trump should be allowed to send ICE agents into hospitals and force new parents to turn over proof that they are domiciled in the United States before their children receive citizenship, because that is what the administration was planning to do here: demand evidence of domicile and allegiance to the country from parents before allowing their kids to receive citizenship, and deny that citizenship if the proof could not be produced. That would have created an underclass, a kind of caste of non-citizens who would be denied the equal rights that the 14th Amendment was enacted to ensure. And they were all fine with it. It is stunning to me that it came so close. And I guess as much as I want to say don't celebrate the court, they don't deserve all the cheers for doing the right thing, I sure am glad that Roberts and Barrett came through, because the alternative would have been a whole hell of a lot worse.
Yeah, I mean, Melissa, what it is that Mark lays out there, the sort of alternative reality, it is upsetting to me as a sentient being. It is also really upsetting to me as a mother to imagine that moment when you've just been through a physically excruciating ordeal, and then on the other side of it, you are so happy because you have your baby, and all of a sudden you're arguing with the state over whether or not they can have a birth certificate. Now, Melissa, we remember the President of the United States attended these arguments. He was, of course, the first sitting president to do so. Here's what he said just yesterday about whether he would accept whatever the Supreme Court decided today.
Will you accept it if it rules against you?
Well, I guess I have to accept it's the Supreme Court, so I'll accept. I think it's very bad for our nation. We're the only nation that does it. No other nation does that birthright citizenship. No, not even close. Some did it, they ended it. It's tremendously destructive. It's extremely costly. I don't know, it's up to them. But in terms of for the good of the country, it'd be great if they didn't allow it. It would be great, but I can't tell you.
Wrong. All wrong. Quick fact check. Not true that no other nation has birthright citizenship. 32 other countries have citizenship laws nearly identical to the United States. But Melissa, my question, especially after reading Kavanaugh here, any type of workaround left for Trump at this point to restrict citizenship?
Oh, clearly, Justice Kavanaugh is offering another pathway to this. He frequently does this in his opinions. Like, this may actually be playing out in a number of different ways, but this is an invitation to Congress to basically fashion a statute that would rescind via legislation what is created by this grant of birthright citizenship. He notes that Congress has the authority to do this, and it is effectively an invitation to do that. I mean, I think where the politics and the law may meet up here is this is an opportunity, I think, for the Democratic Party, the progressive movement, to effectively make these issues part of the midterm platform. You want a better Congress that's going to forestall these kinds of efforts, then you need to put the right people in place and send the right people to Washington in order to prevent what is surely going to be a gathering movement to try and create a statutory rescission of birthright citizenship, as Brett Kavanaugh has laid out here.
Laura? Stephen Miller has been the main architect of the president's hardline immigration agenda. He made his views very clear. Here he is just a few days ago.
This should be a 9-0 ruling in a functioning democracy. The idea that you can have a country where you just set foot on U.S. soil and any child you have gets to be an American citizen and vote in our elections, collect our welfare, sit in our juries, sit in judgment of our fellow men and women is such an outrage to the idea of having a country. If this country doesn't, one way or another, end birthright citizenship, this country doesn't have a future.
So, Laura, given that we understand what is motivating Stephen Miller, what does he do now?
Yeah, Alicia, Stephen Miller has made it very clear, as you said, how he views this. He views this as an existential battle, one that he is seeking to redefine American identity. And he actually did just post in response to the birthright citizenship decision. And I want to read a piece of it for you. He called it one of the most destructive and outrageous decisions in the long history of the Supreme Court. He also said no provision of the Constitution can be read to require our national self-obliteration. Self-obliteration is how he's describing this decision. Now, when it comes to what he does now, in part, he'll continue to do what he has done since the start of this second term, which is to pursue aggressive immigration policies, even more so than the first administration, which he also worked in. That includes attempts to fundamentally change who can immigrate to the United States, strip status, legal status from people who have had it. We just saw the TPS, the temporary protective status decision. They are going to continue to strip that legal status from hundreds of thousands of immigrants who were here legally. And then also the administration has tried to block the adjustment of status, whether it's getting green cards or seeking naturalization or work permits for some 39 countries on that travel ban list. And they are predominantly Muslim, African, and Latin American countries and immigrants that are being blocked there across the board. Also, Miller is on nearly, or his aides are on nearly weekly calls with ICE field directors. And he has overseen the launch of investigations into naturalized citizens, trying to determine whether or not they potentially committed voter fraud before they became citizens, all in this effort to denaturalize as many immigrants as possible. So when Miller talks about birthright citizenship, he tethers that to this existential battle, and he makes it about elections and about politics. Even just talking about it ahead of this decision, Miller has made clear that he believes that that U.S. citizens of undocumented immigrants or temporary immigrants cannot assimilate. He has said that, and he has conveyed that he believes they pose a political threat. So I expect that because of that, his views of this and the Trump administration's views of this, that they are going to react by also continuing and intensifying their push for that Save America proof of citizenship bill that they want Republicans desperately to pass ahead of the midterms.
Final day of the Supreme Court term. We got several major rulings, including on money in politics. That's coming up. But we begin with the clear and final loss for Trump on a key issue. The justices flatly rejecting his infamous bid to try to rewrite the Constitution and change the very definition of citizenship in this country. Now, to remind you, Trump had launched a Hail Mary on this issue in his second term, the kind of thing that he didn't even try in the first term, and that was not going to work if the law were applied, because he wanted to see if he could get away with just writing his own executive order and canceling part of the Constitution to ban birthright citizenship. Now, this was dead on arrival by any legal logic, because presidents can't just override the Constitution, otherwise it would be a meaningless document. Trump critics noting that he had wasted a lot of time and legal capital leading up to this loser of a case and this loss today, with a court rebuke that made waves.
The Supreme Court has just handed down a second major decision this morning, this one on birthright citizenship.
Emphatically rejecting the president's attempt with an executive order to redefine what it means to be a citizen in this country.
For more than 100 years, the rule has been simple. If you're born in America, you are an American, and it looks like that won't change.
So as we celebrate today's ruling, I have a message for President Trump. You may try to redefine what it means to be an American, and you will fail.
Today, the Constitution won. The American people won.
A major loss. So what are we doing here? Well, I'm going to walk you through it. This is not one of those cases that's super complicated or requires a lot of legal intrigue. This loss for Trump means that current citizenship rights hold. So there's actually no change. He was trying to change things in a manner that was flatly unlawful, and he failed. So if someone's born in this country, they are a citizen. And that's, by the way, the core promise of America. A citizenship which is not bound by a test of, say, heritage or race or religion, which we've seen historically in some parts of the world, but rather that American promise, that thing that we talk about that wasn't always perfectly executed, but was the promise, and the Statue of Liberty talk, and the Nation of Immigrants talk, all of that being built in the idea that if you're born here, you're a citizen here, period. Republican-appointed Chief Justice writing today, citizenship was the right to have rights, freely participate in our political community. The framers extended that promise to every free-born person in this land. We keep that promise today. That was always going to be the only logical legal outcome for this case. If the court did its job, which is to apply, first, the plain language and meaning of the Constitution, and second, past precedents, because if you're wondering as you watch the news, is this a new thing? Have we ever looked into this? We have, in many different details. Other cases were somewhat more nuanced because we didn't have a president trying to just cancel the Constitution this way. But if the courts do what I'm telling you is their job, look at the plain meaning of the law and prior precedents, this was never close. In fact, it's kind of striking that this court even took the case. In a different era, it might have simply let stand lower courts ruling against a blatantly unlawful executive order. How did we get here? If you're doing the count here on the last day of the term, the majority was 6. So even though there's a majority of Republican appointees on the court, they're going against a Republican president, as you see there. 3 Republicans and 3 Democratic appointees in the majority ruling against Trump. Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch, as you see, went so far as to dissent and make what are basically legally fantastical claims that they would actually support a president being able to unilaterally change the Constitution. They would allow Trump, they say, by executive fiat to essentially end birthright citizenship. And if you're wondering, gosh, would they let a President Obama or a future President AOC slash out parts of the Constitution that they don't like for their ideological reasons? Well, that's why so many members of this court face a consistency, credibility, and sometimes self-dealing corruption crisis. They're not credible, some of them. Now, if you dive into the details, there was also some debate about whether this citizenship right is actually rooted in the Constitution, and I will read you that passage in a moment to remind you, but a debate over whether it's there or is it rooted in some other branch of government. Kavanaugh said, well, maybe Congress could enact new legislation establishing exceptions to this very citizenship that the court upheld. Now, on the one hand, that could be a kind of musing. Maybe Congress can do something. But in what's going on today, and that coming from a Trump appointee, it also could be read as kind of the court upholding a law, a rule, while also brainstorming how a MAGA Congress could help undo the very thing they're upholding. And judges aren't really supposed to do that. Again, as I'm saying, to be as fair as possible, it kind of depends on how you interpret what Kavanaugh wrote. But I can tell you that the president who appointed him, Donald Trump, today saw it that way, posting about that very idea, which is also probably dead on arrival in this Congress, which is now adjourned. But Trump has been invested in this case from the start. He even attended oral arguments, which he can choose to do, but it's a rarity for presidents. We can now report today for the first time that he was sitting in and watching his own loss because he badly lost this case with Trump appointees voting against him, something we know he seems to take personally, even though the whole point is it's not supposed to go by just party or appointment. So the court is upholding the Constitution on this issue tonight. Now, I told you this one's pretty clear. I'll remind you the words. You might have seen them in school or in the news. All persons born or naturalized in the U.S. are citizens of the U.S. Doesn't leave a lot of room for miscommunication. If you are born or naturalized here, you're a citizen here. The jurisdiction thereof is the legalese about the fact that you are under the jurisdiction of the place that you are. The Chief Justice, and this is kind of as close as you'll get as shade or a kind of a diss from judges who are notoriously pretty careful, even when they're sparring with each other. The Chief Justice, in a sign of basically shading how off the Trump argument was, said, well, if you want to know what that means, just read it. And he quoted it verbatim in the ruling today. Children born of parents unlawfully or temporarily present in the U.S. are under the Constitution citizens at birth. In other words, sometimes I've told you politics can feel like a lot of people debating a book that they haven't read. It's like a book club, but we haven't done the reading. Internet politics can certainly feel like that sometimes, but also if you go to a dinner or a barbecue, you're like, wait, what do they know? What do they think? And sometimes that problem reaches all the way up to the Supreme Court, where what I'm telling you, not my view, not some critic's view, but the majority of the court signed on to that opinion, including the Republican Chief Justice, and they're basically shading Trump and his three would-be enablers in dissent to say, if you read the Constitution, we wouldn't even be here today.